just like Brian Andrew Dubois, age 55, of Appleton, Wisconsin, formerly Braidwood, Illinois, passed away Monday, February 13th, 2023, in Wisconsin. He was born on April 18th, 1967, in Joliet, Illinois, to Richard and Ann Dubois. As a young boy, Brian loved all sports, but baseball was his passion. He was very competitive and always felt the need to win. Brian graduated in 1985 from Reed Custer High School. In that same year, he was drafted in the Baltimore Orioles organization, then went on to play with the Detroit Tigers. After his years of playing in the MLB, he continued to work with AT&T and also enjoyed his time coaching. He is survived by his mother, Ann Dubois of Wilmington, his sons, Tyler of New Jersey, Brian of Springfield, Illinois, and Zach of Springfield, granddaughter, Emmy May of Springfield, siblings, Dennis Dubois of Essex, Illinois, Christine Crump of Braidwood, Laura Dubois of Gardner, Illinois, niece Kaylee Crump, nephew Ryan Garbin, and girlfriend Elizabeth Lair of Wisconsin. Preceding him in death were his father, Richard Dubois, maternal grandparents Eldon and Laura Flint, paternal grandparents Andrew Dubois and Catherine Rainey, and brother-in-law Jeff Crump. If you all take a look around and you look at the pictures, you know, you have one where it's Brian growing up and you see that youthful smile and you see that baseball uniform. And I meant to ask you, did he sleep in that uniform until he outgrew it to sleep in the next one? So many of us remember him in that. Yeah, it was it might have been too dirty, Ann, but he didn't care. But I think what you see is you transition from a video to the different collages in the pictures as somebody much more than a Major League Baseball player. He was my Little League hero, and before I thought Brian knew my name, I was out pitching in Little League one day, and I really didn't know he knew me, and I was doing okay and having some success, and all of a sudden I saw him standing there staring at me intently, and he didn't even have to say a word, because that meant everything to me, because I didn't think he knew who I was, but I knew who he was. And I walked off the field, and when Brian Dubois says, "Good job, man," it meant everything to a little kid. So much, in fact, that one time we were in your backyard raking leaves. Brian, Dennis Garrett, and I, we were raking leaves, and we made a pile about as high as these flowers right here. And Brian took off, man. He was such an athlete, and he took off and did this somersault and landed perfectly in the leaves to where you couldn't even see him, just leaves flying everywhere. And then he scooped him back up, and then Dennis went, and he was excited. And then I was number 3. It was my turn to go, and I took off running, and I wanted to impress Brian, so I overshot the pile and landed on my shoulder and broke my collarbone. And I got up, and I was standing sideways, and Brian said, "Hey, man, normally I'd tell you to be tough, but you should probably go home." Brian was a loyal protector of his family. And Chrissy and I talked about this, but I had PE class my freshman year with Brian and Chrissy. And Brian had just served, and I was over here to the side, and somehow the ball got away, and Chrissy was about 20 feet in front of me. And I grabbed the ball, and I was a freshman. I was a big goof nerd and jacking around, and I did this weird spin and tried to chuck the ball to the other side. And Chris, I'm so sorry. I think I might have hit you right in the behind with the ball. I mean, and you looked at me with this look like you weren't going to kill me, but you were going to kill me. And I said, "I am so sorry." And I was so embarrassed, this little freshman. And Brian's like, "Hey, she'll kill you." Like, I know, Brian, I know. And then he said, "And when she's done, I'll do it." I'm like, "I got you, man." But then after, he just still gave me a high five. Brian was never afraid to talk to people. Guy was larger in life, man. I'd walk down the hall at Reed Custer High School to see him. And I remember this one day, he said, "Hey, man, don't look down when you walk. Look up. Be proud. Look up. Look eyes forward. See the people that are in front of you. Say hi to people." And I mean, it was easy for the guy that everybody knew, and he's talking to everybody, but he gave me courage to be who I was. I was always in awe of watching him play, not just baseball, but basketball and football. And I remember in football, I was standing on the sideline one time as a freshman, and there was some fan standing there, and they remembered watching him like, oh, that's that baseball player, but he can't play football. And 5 seconds later, Brian laid a hit on somebody and laid him out like snot bubbles out of just laid that dude out. And I'm this little dude. I looked up and like, you, and he didn't have anything to say, and that was just really cool. And we all know that Coach Brian had this like national pickoff record for a while, and he still is up there. He picked so many people off, but what many of you don't know that are baseball fans is Brian picked me off more than anybody, because when he would pitch, oftentimes I would play right field. And Coach Kogel always taught us back up the throw. And so Brian would throw home, but I thought he was picking off. And so I'd run over there. Thankfully, they didn't hit it. And then I would stand there and think he's throwing home, and then he'd pick off. And so I was like the whole game back and forth, just sitting there going like this, like, what are you doing? Are you dancing out there? I'm like, no, I'm trying to figure this dude out just like everybody else is. It's amazing. And then one time we were taking outfield practice right out here at the field at Reed Custer. And he was our starting center fielder, and he would throw a ball in with the cannon that he had. Brian didn't have just a cannon on the mound. Brian had a cannon from the outfield too, and he would dare you to run an extra base. And sometimes I think Brian held onto the ball a little bit just so you could get a couple extra steps and challenge you and still throw you out by 30 feet. And then they'd throw back to second and get you out, and he would just stand there and kind of do that little shimmy like, yeah, I got you, man. I ain't just a pitcher. But one day during outfield practice, I threw a ball, my arm hurt. I was shaking it. I'm like, oh, man. He's like, hey, man, be tough. I'm like, I'm trying, but my arm hurts. He said, listen, Les, if you're injured, get off the field. That's acceptable. But if you're hurt, you play through it. You be tough. And I know that the couple years I got to play in the big leagues was because I got to play behind a big leaguer like him. Guy Nowak and I were talking about this earlier today. As a freshman coming in, I had the opportunity to play with and to watch these guys coming up all the way through and to watch how they did it right and how they hustled and worked hard and led, and it was amazing. You know, I was blessed with a lot of great coaches growing up, but teammates that are leaders are hard to find, and I think we all know that in every aspect of life. It's hard to find people in your sphere of influence together with you that are good leaders. And Brian was an exceptional leader. Some of my final conversations, including my radio interview with Brian, on my radio show, I was asking him, I had 45 minutes of content, and I kept asking him questions, and he'd answer the question, and then he would turn it back to me. I'm like, Brian, remember the time you picked this dude off? He's like, yeah, I remember that. This is what happened, but what about the time you did this? I remember that time I would hit behind him in order. He was always the leadoff hitter, and I was always the second hitter. And you used to always make me bunt him over. I'm like, why'd you make me bunt him over? He's like so fast, he's going to steal third before I even get to 2 pitches anyway. But just watching him do his thing, it was amazing, and he would always turn the conversation back to somebody else. And if there was anybody that could live this life in a way that he's like, yeah, I'm pretty good at this sport, I'm pretty good at what I do, it was Brian. And yet that's not how he was to me. Brian was a selfless guy. He always asked about me. He always complimented me. And to this day, even in Brian's passing, he's still encouraging me. I still see that kid behind the fence telling this little kid that I look up to, him still saying, good job, man. Way to go. I can picture it. I can see it. And I can hear his voice. And it's still lifting me up. It's still making me feel like I can push through. I think in some way, shape, or form, all of us that are here had some story or a bunch of stories or just a part of life that we'll remember that Brian is always, for as long as we live, going to continue to talk to us. So Elizabeth, thank you for getting to know you and sharing these previous years, and to his entire family growing up. Thank you for letting me break my collarbone in your backyard. But on a serious note, thank you. Don't be sorry. I wouldn't change it for the world. And thank you for sharing him with so many people but especially those that are here today that loved him and will always love him. Thank you.
For a lot of you guys, is this on? Sorry, okay. For the folks who may not know who I am, I've kind of changed a little bit over the last several years here. My name is Dwayne Robinson, like most of you here today. Brian was our best friend. Best friend. And Dennis, he was definitely your biology, your brother, but I can tell you this. He was definitely my little brother. We loved each other to death. And when you guys moved in next door, Lincoln Street, Mr. Kogel knew it after you moved in, you didn't want to go down that street. You had a bunch of brothers. We did nothing but in that backyard where you broke your shoulder. We did a lot more than that. We did a lot more than that. And I don't know how the mothers did it, but Dennis, he was a great guy. He loved you. He loved every one of you guys. Lori, all of you guys. Brian, it's just a sad thing. Me and Brian, from that day you moved in, I think he was 5 or 6. We've gone on this journey together from day one of life, of the good and the bad. And if anybody's been friends with brother, like with Brian, like we are, even a coach, there's good times and there's bad times. But one thing I'll say is what Billy told me the other day. Brian was our guy, and we were Brian's guy. And we were family. And for the good and the bad, we support each other. So as I was putting this together, and I was going to put down the notes, my wife goes, Dwayne, stop. Wing it. Just wing it. Make it come from the heart. And as you guys know, I probably had 8 pages of notes, so I threw it away. She threw it away. 33 years of marriage, you threw my notes away. Winging it. I'll never marry, and as Les was talking about Brian, and Dennis remembers this, Brian Bouchers is here, the Kings are here. We played baseball in that backyard every day. And I'll never forget this. It was always, hey, Dennis, you want to play? Brian was little Dubois, right? He was like 5 years old, 5, 6 years old. We're 8, 9, 10 years old. He was 5 years old, and he was always there. He was always getting the ball, right? Getting the ball and throw it back. And finally we needed another player. Okay, little Dubois, come on, you can play. Here's the sad part. He was better than all of us. And he was heavy, and he was this size, right? You know, he was a half our age. So I remember as we've gone through this journey, and I remember that my freshman year, his freshman year, and my varsity year, we were scrimmaging the varsity. So Mr. Kogo had our starting lineup set up there, and I'm sure I'm going to get the story wrong, which I'll make it even more entertaining, I guess. But he had our starting lineup there, and Brian, freshman year, he's up there, and I don't know if he struck all 3 of them out, but he got all 3 out, and my brother was a pretty good ball player too. He's a pretty good ball player. And he struck my brother out on 3 pitches, and he threw the bat. And of course, Mr. Kogo told Scott, go hit it. And he looked at Brian and goes, you're dressing for us tomorrow. And not only did he dress, as you mentioned about, he was more than just a pitcher. He not only dressed, he batted first, and he took my position in right field. Yeah, my senior year, he took my position in right field. We could talk about that later, but he took my position. I'll never forget when you won state, when you got drafted. He never changed. He was Brian. Whenever he came home, he'd come over to the house. We'd watch football together. He'd hang out with my family. At that time, I was having children. My daughter, Katie, he'd play dress up with Katie. He'd have barrettes in his hair and stuff. I wish I could have found the picture to bring it. But that's what Brian was. And as you mentioned, Les, every time you asked a question, how he was doing, what he was doing, he'd always ask, how are you doing? How are you? Because he never wanted to be the center of attention. So I'm so happy everybody's here today. He'd be upset the way he is, right? It's not about me, but you know what, Brian, today? It is about you. And I remember when he came back from Aberdeen, Deb, when you were pregnant, and he decided, hey, it's probably time. And he came back, he got a job, he actually worked with me. We actually drove back and forth every day to work. There were some long mornings and nights with him driving in that car sometimes. Brian talked a lot. You didn't know that? He did talk a lot. And then I'll never forget, and you mentioned AT&T, not many people know he worked there. But I'll tell you guys this. When he got that job, and Debbie, you know this, it was like he got drafted again. He was happy. He was proud. He's going to support his family. And he was doing all that datacom stuff until the last minute. I talked to him just a couple days before he passed. And Elizabeth, thank you. I thank you on behalf of everybody here. I just got to thank you. For you letting me have them conversations with Brian at the end, it means a lot. Same with my wife and my daughter. My daughter was there when we were saying goodbye. So I want to thank you. But Brian was so happy of his family and so protective of his family. And I want you guys to know that. Because sometimes Brian's always has an edge to him, right? He's always had an edge. So thanks so much for being here. I do appreciate it, and I guarantee you, Brian appreciates it, but he's probably all mad at us right now, but that's fine. He'll get over it. Okay? And Elizabeth, thank you for letting me come up here and speak. Thank you so much.
It's always great to return to Reed Custer, even under these circumstances. We all know this. Brian would want this day to be a combination of celebration, homecoming, storytelling, maybe tipping a few. And looking around this room, I don't think that's going to be a problem. We have a lot to be proud of in our Reed Custer community. We have a lot of people who have excelled, even in Hollywood, Major League Baseball, or in everyday life. They've become very, very successful. And a lot of them are here today. However, there's no one I'm more proud of than my friend Les. From a gangly kid who could flat out mash a baseball to a USA Olympic team member, from being a sophomore starter on our first state championship team to being a collegiate All-American, playing for the best coach in the nation, Gordy Gillespie, from being the Royals minor league player of the year to making the big league team in 1995, from being an inspirational speaker to being a color analyst on Royals TV, and a husband and a father of two great kids. He's someone I'm very thankful for and proud to call my friend, Les Norman. There are some people I definitely want to mention. The first is Ann Dubois. In 1985, there was an article that appeared in the Chicago newspaper. And part of it read like this. Ann Dubois' mother was afraid to let her daughter go swimming with the other children. So Ann decided at a young age that my kids aren't going to be taught to be afraid of anything. It may explain why son Brian will survive the 1,000,000-to-1 shot the Baltimore Orioles served him by selecting him as their first choice, the first pick in the 4th round in Monday's amateur draft. I always wanted to be better than everyone else, Brian said. But I don't know if I should say that. I don't want people to say that I'm cocky. It was Dubois' confidence when he was younger that made him say, "Just watch, Mom. I'm going to be a major leaguer someday." Brian was 8 when his mother started hearing from other Little League mothers how good her son was. But it was hard to get off her afternoon shift as a machine operator to see him play ball. I wasn't surprised at how good he was, his mother said. He was never afraid of anything. Even when she realized her son's fearlessness was always getting him hurt, she didn't discourage his aggressive style. When he was growing up in the Joliet area, kids from the playground would ask his mother and father, Richard, if they could take Brian to play ball. Now, as Major League stardom beckons, his mother has the same answer. Sure, you can take him, as long as you bring him back. Ann and Dennis and Chrissy and Laura, we're all praying for your family. And we appreciate you very much. I also want to mention Elizabeth. Those of us who knew Brian, were very, very thankful for Elizabeth. She was with Brian till the very end. She coordinated all of our phone calls. She didn't know any of us. She only knew us by name and a phone number. And she coordinated all of our phone calls. She was so pleasant and so reassuring on the phone. Elizabeth was wonderful. She handled everything with grace and love. And I've told her more than once, Elizabeth, you now have a lot of friends here in Braidwood. I need to mention our good friend Jeff Ritchie, who spearheaded our GoFundMe account. We appreciate that very much, Jeff. I want to give a shout out to the rest of the Braidwood Mafia, I'll call them, looking around this room. It was great to see everyone. Brian loved the Reed Custer community, and the community loved him back. He was one of us, and he was proud of it. He told me several times that his biggest thrill in baseball was playing for the Comets. Maybe Brian's greatest attribute was his acceptance and appreciation of all people, from the highest of the high to the not so high. It didn't matter to Brian. He had friends from all walks of life. And that's one thing that I will always remember about him. Kids flocked to Brian. Many of you were those kids and are here today. Brian had a magnetic personality for children. He made the children feel special, as though they were the only ones that mattered to Brian. I told Brian several times he should have been a teacher, because he would have been a great one. I don't remember the first time I met Brian, because he was always around. We lived across the street from Brian. I barely noticed the kid who would later have such a profound effect on my life and my family's life. But as he grew older and began to become a lot more noticeable, he was constantly playing catch or throwing a ball against the garage. Plus, as he moved into high school, he spent a few evenings using our dining room table as a study table to keep him eligible at my request. I do, however, remember vividly the first time I saw Brian on the mound in high school. And you've heard it mentioned here today. It was a fresh soft versus the varsity inter-squad game to prepare both teams for their first game. Brian was pitching for the fresh soft team that day. My varsity team, all players filled with testosterone, machismo, they were ecstatic at the opportunity to hit against Brian. And I remember it as clear as day. Brian set them down 1, 2, 3, strikeout, strikeout, strikeout. From that day on, he was our number one pitcher for 4 years. Everyone has a Brian Dubois story. One of the great things about today is we will all sit around telling Brian Dubois stories. I remember having a meeting with Brian before his sophomore year. His freshman year, he was sensational. He averaged 2 strikeouts per inning. I called him into my office, and I had a little heart-to-heart talk with him, and I said, Brian, I don't want you to put pressure on yourself. I don't want you to worry about things, because there is no way that you're going to be able to match the statistics that you had last year as a freshman. He looked at me as though I had 2 heads. And he clearly, plain as day, said, why not? And then I started to understand the mental process that is Brian Dubois. Why not? Brian was drafted in the 4th round by Baltimore. But really, he was the Orioles' first-round pick because they did not have a pick in rounds 1, 2, or 3 because they had signed 3 free agents. So he was the first pick that they got to make, and it was taken on Brian. He was not very big, something which rankled him throughout his life. He didn't throw very hard. He threw 85 coming out of high school. That wouldn't even get him noticed in today's game. But he had, as a high school senior, he had a big league, what he called, drop ball. It was really a overhand curveball. And he was incredible. And he had an incredible spirit of competitiveness. Oh, and he had a pretty fair pickoff move as well. One day we were playing Coal City at beautiful Comet Park. And a Coal City player who I always liked, he was a baseball player, baseball kid, managed to get a hit off Brian. He might have flared one into right field or whatever, but he got a base hit. And he was standing at first base. This was a stocky kid. He was no greyhound. He was not a threat to steal. He was standing at first base. The entire Coal City dugout was calling across the diamond to him, saying, "Don't get picked." And he stood there and went like this, like, "I got this." He took a lead off that was not more than 3 or 4 steps, 3 or 4 feet. And Brian threw over to first base, picked the kid so cleanly that the kid could not even move to go back to first base. In fact, all he could do, and I remember this so clearly, his shoulders slumped down like this, and he dropped to his knees, totally defeated. And it wasn't something that you made fun of the kid for, because it was Brian being Brian. And it was just an incredible play. There's one other situation. We were playing Bishop McNamara, once again at beautiful Comet Park. Brian was not pitching this day. He was in center field, his usual spot. And we had the lead. It may have been Joe or someone else pitching. But we had the lead. But as the game went into the 6th or 7th inning, Mac started to claw back into the game. And it started to get a little dicey. So I went to the mound and called in Brian. So Brian comes trotting in. Bishop McNamara's dugout was hooting and hollering and happy because they were going to get to face Brian Dubois. Brian did not take it that way. Brian came in, walked up the backside of the mound. I handed him the ball, and his exact words were, "Watch this, I'm going to blow him away." That was Brian Dubois. Very quickly, his senior year, I gave the seniors that year shirts. Said Reed Custer Baseball on it. And it had a secret insignia on the shirt that said DOM. Depend on me. And I only gave it to the seniors, and I told them, you can't let anybody know what that stands for. They're going to be asking you, girlfriends, they're all going to be asking you. You can't tell them what that is. Brian's response to that was not depend on me, it was Dubois on the mound. It looks like most everyone in here will remember from the 80s Denise Williams' song, "Let's Hear It for the Boy." I played that on my phone just to hear it again. Of course, in Brian's world, it wasn't "Let's Hear It for the Boy." It was "Let's Hear It for Dubois." I've had that song rattling around my head since 1985. Now you will too. You can thank Brian for that. Every coach should have an opportunity to coach a Brian Dubois. He taught me more than I ever taught him. One thing Brian taught me was an appreciation for the way a competitor thinks, his mental makeup. Winning was Brian's ultimate goal. He couldn't accept less. If we were losing or not playing well, Brian would become very surly, to put it nicely. He was not pleasant to be around. Some would think him cocky or arrogant, but that expression is what fueled him and made him great. It wasn't ever personal. But you don't get one without the other. You don't get his greatness without his competitive fire. There are several coaches, players, managers, and Batgirls in this room who have a state championship medal because of Brian. In closing, I want to thank you, Brian, for all you have done for me and my family and this community. Say hi to Coach Shy, to Wally, Scott, and all the other Comets. We'll have a great old-timers game when we all get there. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth. Boy, where do I start? This is my sister Jan in the front row in the red. She's been my rock through all this. This is a celebration of Brian's life, and Brian would want us all to be happy. Many of you have shared your stories with me about how Brian has played a part in your lives, and now I'd like to do the same. I want to share the happy stories with you. Brian is such a kind, caring, generous, thoughtful, special, loving man. Brian and I met through a mutual friend. Our first date was to a supper club, and we laughed so hard all night long that our stomachs hurt. It was to the point where you literally could not even look at each other because you were gonna just start cracking up. And it's like, please, just don't look at me right now. Brian, Hannah, who is my Down syndrome daughter, who's 26, and I would have dance parties at our house. Brian would pick out the songs, play them on his phone, and we would just dance the night away. Fast songs, slow songs, all types of songs to different music. And Brian was actually a very good dancer. Now when it came to singing, though, that was another story. He used to tell me that everyone thought he was had such a good voice when he sang. And I said, really? And he said, really? So when a song came on the radio, he'd start singing, and I'd rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being not so good, and 10 being he knocked it out of the park. He would sing, and then he'd just look at me with that look and say, well, waiting for his score. And I'd give him like a 2 or a 3. And he would say, you suck. And I would say, I'm just being honest. Brian always told me that I was the only one that said he couldn't sing. And I said, Brian, the reason everyone said you were so good is because they didn't want to hurt your feelings. I think the highest score he ever got from me was an 8. Brian loved to golf, and I was just starting to learn to play golf, so Brian said he'd take and teach me. I told Brian I just wanted to golf for fun, no competition between us because we are both very competitive. Next thing I know, Brian's like, Elizabeth, we have to get you golf shoes and a golf glove and new clubs. And I'm like, Brian, I don't think all that's gonna help my golf game. And he says, it can't hurt. He really did give me some good golfing pointers, though. Brian also loved to go out to eat at family restaurants, not fast food joints either. And every time we'd walk into a restaurant, no matter where it was, Brian had to have the seat facing the entrance door. After a while, I said, Brian, why do you always have to face the entrance door? I said, are you afraid someone's after you or what? And he said, no, it's because if someone crazy comes in to do any harm, he would jump in front of me to protect me. He said he would take a bullet for me, and my heart melted then and there. One of the special things that Brian and I would do is what Brian would call coffee talk. This is where we would have deep conversations about anything that was on our mind, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It really brought us closer together. This is probably one of the things that I'm going to miss the most about Brian, and holding his hand. Brian had the biggest, softest hands. When we would hold hands, they would fit together like a ball in a glove. Pun intended. From the first time I met Brian, he always wanted to be baptized. Now, I'm a pretty religious person most of the time, so I was trying to figure out how could I make this happen. Turns out God took care of this for us. When Brian was in the hospital in December and not doing so well, the nurse asked the chaplain to come in, and Brian was baptized by the Reverend James Durnell. Jump now to February, and James just happened to be the chaplain on call, and he administered Brian his last rites. It all came full circle. Brian became a grandpa to Emmy Mae Dubois on January 21st, 2023. I said, congratulations, Grandpa, and he just smiled. I know deep down he was truly a proud grandpa because of this moment. Brian loved my Hannah like she was his stepdaughter. We would do many fun things together, bowling, dancing, going out to eat, or just hanging out. Hannah would always say to Brian, I love you, Dubois. Brian would just smile. So my real name is Elizabeth. Brian just happened to be the only one that called me Elizabeth. He liked the name Elizabeth and thought it was prettier than Betty. And he also said Betty was an older person name, and that's how come you all know me as Elizabeth. Brian and I would always say to each other, I love you. We never went to bed or hung up the phone not saying I love you. When Brian was starting to decline, he would say, I love you. But then he started adding, you're the best. Brian saying you're the best will always stay in my heart. The day before Thanksgiving, our lives were flipped upside down. We were told that Brian had liver cancer. Since then, we were in and out of hospitals and had more doctor visits than we cared to remember. On Monday, we had hope of Brian getting better. On Friday, we were taking Brian off of life support. Brian is a true fighter. The doctors and everyone were quite surprised how strong Brian's heart and lungs were. Not that this would have changed Brian's outcome at all. You all, Brian didn't realize how much he was loved by everyone. I bet he is looking down on us from heaven right now with a huge smile on his face. And I would like to mention a few family members and friends who were instrumental in Brian's life. Little Brian, he loved you so much. I can't express how much your dad loved you. To Zach, he loved you as if you were his own. Uncle Joe Dubois, he cherished your talks with him. I think you kept him grounded. David Chu. Chu was a friend of Brian's who would always call and say, how's my favorite baseball pitcher? Ken and Nancy, Brian's neighbors, who would always be there for Brian, and when they had extras at mealtime, they always shared with Brian, and Brian did the same, vice versa. Kenny and Squirrel. Brian, I swear, would have Kenny's number on speed dial. Anytime Brian had a question about how to fix anything or do anything, his first call was to Kenny. Hector. Every time the phone would ring, Brian would say, it's Hector. He probably wants to talk about baseball. He's the baseball guy. Hector loves baseball, and Brian and Hector would talk on the phone sharing stories. Terry and Stephanie, Brian's cousin. Brian had a close connection with these two. They came to visit Brian at our house, and I know it meant a lot to Brian. Jeff Ritchie, NBA. I know Brian valued your friendships. Thank you for coming and visiting at the house. And Jeff, I can't thank you enough for helping me through these past few weeks, for your posting on Facebook on my behalf, taking my calls at all hours, for everything. Les Norman. When I called Les about Brian, Les mentioned to me that he grew up with Brian and made it in the big leagues like Brian, and that he was an ordained minister. And if I ever needed any help, all I had to do was reach out. Well, as you can see, I did reach out, and Les really stepped up to the plate, and I am forever thankful. Dwayne Robinson. Dwayne is a family friend and grew up with Brian in the neighborhood. Dwayne reached out to me after Brian's passing and just let me vent and figure things out. I want to thank you. Jerry Kogel. Thank you for instilling good values in Brian as a kid when you were his high school coach. I know he enjoyed your friendship. Billy Dubois, Rich Walden, Roberta, Becky, Dallas, Roger. Thank you all for reaching out and for your friendships with Brian. Chuck Anderson. Thank you for the tour you gave Brian and me when we came to visit this past year. It was nice to see Brian's old stomping grounds and hearing of Brian's high school days on and off the diamond. Tim McDowell, thank you for your kindness to Brian and myself. To Brian's family, I just want to say I'm sorry. To all the doctors, nurses from Friedert and EMC who helped with Brian's care, including Dr. Sarah White, NP Clarissa, NP Anna, RN Sarah, and all the staff. Thank you for your knowledge and kindness. To my kids, thank you for being there for me when Brian was sick and for taking care of Hannah. I love you. To my brothers and sisters, friends, and my new friends, thank you for all being there for me. Finally, I want you all to know that any messages that I received, I was able to read them to Brian prior to his passing. I told Brian he had so many friends and family that loved him. I told Brian that he pitched his perfect no-hitter, that the game was won by him, and to go celebrate with the Lord. I want to thank all of you for everything you have done for Brian and me. I truly thank you. Brian, I hope I made you proud. I hope that I did everything that you have wanted with no regrets. I'll see you on the other side. You have my heart forever. You're the best. I will always love you. Thank you.
Is it just me, or is anybody ever going to look at the number 2 the same way? No way. No, Elizabeth, I think about when we had talked on the phone and said Friday he had taken him off the machine and that he made it until Monday into the wee hours. My first thought was, you stubborn dude, man. That was his one more way of, instead of starting, he wanted to close the thing out on his terms. As I close, I haven't told a lot of people this, but a few years ago, Brian and I had a conversation on the phone that lasted over an hour. And we had talked about faith. We talked about God. And I don't even remember how we breached the subject. But as we talked, he listened intently, and he asked good questions. And then as he spoke, I listened intently and asked questions of him. And I was amazed that how much Brian knew, and I always knew he was a caring guy, but man, he just poured his heart out. And I love so much of that about him. And one of the verses that we talked about was Romans 3:23. It said, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And we got into this deep conversation about how we were all sinners, saved by grace, and that it all started with Adam and Eve way back in, and that so we all have to live with that sin. But then there was the hope in Romans 6:23 that said, for the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Christ Jesus our Lord. And I'll tell you what, when Brian Dubois used to take the mound, it gave me hope. There's always hope. I remember in the semifinal game of the state tournament, Joe Keane was throwing a masterpiece, man, against Quincy Notre Dame. You clutched it up, dude, and you left, and it was, I think, 7-4 when you left, and Brian came in. And no offense, Joe, I had hope when you were on the mound because you were dealing, but when Brian came in, my hope level went pretty far up. But that was a masterful move by Coach Kogel because you earned that win. So Brian got to say, but you earned that win, and he was more than happy to come in and give you what you deserved, what you had earned. And then finally, we talked about this before, but I'd called him the Tuesday before he'd gone on life support. And I didn't catch him, and I thought, he's pretty sick, and I don't know if he's going to call back, so I'm just going to text him. But 10 minutes later, the dude called me back. And he didn't sound great. His voice had trailed off, and you could tell he was weak. But in his words, he was still Brian Dubois. In his words, he was still, matter of fact, things are good. Don't feel bad for me. This is what's going on. These are the facts. And I said, Brian, do you have a Bible in the house? And he said, I do. He said, but you know what, Les? Tell me. Tell me the verse that you want me to look up and read, and I'll read it. I said, I want you to look up Romans 10:9 and 10. He said, well, tell me, what does it say? And I said, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. He said, I love that verse. Les, I'll read that again. And I was so thankful for that conversation that we had. And Elizabeth, the calls that you took those last few days, in that room, and you held that phone to his ear so everyone could talk to him that wanted to talk to him, is one of the most special, loving, honoring things that I have ever heard of in my life. That was amazing. Thank you for that. You have blessed so many people here to have that one last tie to one incredible dude. Your strength through all this, I can't even put words to it. You're amazing, and thank you for that. And I even called back a second time and said, I've got one more thing to say. And you said, okay, as soon as the nurse leaves. And you called me right back, and you held the phone up so I could say one last thing and say my goodbyes to him. Thank you so much for that. The Deuce is always going to be remembered. The Deuce did great things on the mound, but the Deuce did great things in the backyards, on the bikes, at baseball fields all over this state, and as a professional athlete all over this country. But I think the most important thing for me that Brian did was because of who he was and what he did. He made us feel good about ourselves. And that's the Brian that I want to remember the most. Not just the amazing stuff on the baseball field, but the amazing stuff he did in our lives to make us not just look up to him, but to be that kid in the hallway that said, hey, put your chin up, look forward when you walk, be a leader, be proud of who you are. It wasn't just, hey, notice who I am. Depend on me, Dubois on the mountain. I remember that. That's funny. Thank you for that. That's so funny. But in the next sentence, he would tell you, be proud of who you are. Play your game. Live your life, because we know that Brian was going to live his way, and that's exactly what he did. So as I close out the service today, thank you all for being here on behalf of the family, on behalf of Elizabeth. So many former teammates and friends and coaches and people that grew up with him and knew him, relatives. Thank you all for sharing him with us. I'm going to pray over our time, and then I'll dismiss. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for Brian. We thank you so much for Brian being in our lives. Thank you so much for what he taught us. Thank you so much for his family, for his girlfriend, for his coaches, players, teammates, everyone in life that he touched. Thank you so much for giving him to us to share him. I pray, Heavenly Father, that today we would remember him as your creation, as someone that met you, as someone that was just tough and strong and eager to get better and eager to do more. But more importantly, Lord, when you came on this earth, you came to serve other people. Brian loved kids. He loved people. He served other people. He looked out for other people. He championed the underdog. He was that tough competitor that you created, Lord, but he also loved other people like you created as well. So we thank you. I pray that you would heal this family, heal his loved ones, heal all of us that are mourning the loss of one great dude, the Deuce, Brian Dubois. In Jesus' name, amen. The family, Elizabeth, would like all of you you're all invited to join us, the VFW in Wilmington, for a dinner from now when you get there. We do have to be out by 5:30. They have something going on there tonight, but we would like to invite everyone that would like to go, the VFW right in Wilmington across from Fletti Plaza, to join us. And there is only a fraction of the stories from Brian Dubois that you heard today. Only a fraction. So that's going to be a great time for all of you to share and speak and just get to know faces that you haven't seen in Brian's honor. So one more time, on behalf of the Deuce, one of the greatest guys I knew, and by far, and even playing in the big leagues, by far, the greatest, most competitive athlete I've ever seen. Thank you all for being here. Have a great day.